welcome to our webinar. We are a team of criminology researchers and lecturers working in Scottish universities, part of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, or the SCCJR for short. Thank you to our colleagues in the Modern Studies Association, and thanks especially to all those studying modern studies who submitted these questions. We will answer 10 of your questions in total. We have also provided a list of sources at the end in our bibliography, which you might find useful for your coursework. We also want to highlight that there are plenty of learning resources on a wide range of topics which can be found on the SCCJR website, and you can find a link to this on the final slide. Thank you for listening.
So what is criminology? And where do criminologists work? What kind of agencies and fields do people who have studied criminology work in? Well, let's start with the first question. Criminology is an interdisciplinary field. It's made up of people who might have studied a number of different areas like psychology or social work or criminology or policing and so on. It focuses on crime and theories of crime and harm, because sometimes what we need to look at as criminologists goes beyond what's legally defined as legal or illegal to look at the harms that are also caused and the collateral consequences. It's also a field that considers people who commit crime and the people and places who are affected by it. That includes victims, families, and communities. A lot of us are trained in sociology, and that means that we understand the bigger social structural factors and influences that might affect what happens in terms of crime trends, but also in terms of who gets criminalised, who gets over or under policed, and who gets punished at higher or lower rates. Criminology is a vibrant and dynamic field. It's not for the faint-hearted. In reality, it's not much like TV or the movies. If you go on to study criminology and criminal justice and want to work in the area, you might not be encountering many serial killers. You might not be picking up many DNA samples at a crime scene unless you have a job directly relevant to that. But there are many areas that people who have studied criminology can work. That could be intelligence services or the police. It could be in the courts. It could be considering issues of environmental harm and environmental crime and how that affects the climate or local communities that have had land or water polluted. There's mainstream criminal justice agencies like prisons, probation, or justice social work. The third sector is involved in offering victim support services or mentoring to people who have left crime behind, or they might be supporting issues that happen across borders, like supporting people affected by human trafficking and modern slavery. A common area for criminologists to work is in universities doing research, or in governments, local government, national government, UK government, parliaments, looking at policies around criminal justice.
So, what are the crime trends across Scotland? Most recent and up-to-date crime statistics for Scotland are available from Scottish Crime and Justice Survey, which is conducted every year with randomly selected sample of households, included aiming to represent all private residential households, as well as from the Scottish Government's report on recorded crime in Scotland. In general, total recorded crime in Scotland has decreased by 4% between 2020-21 and 2021 and 22. Compared to England and Wales, the risk of being a victim of crime is lower in Scotland by roughly 2%. Experience of crime also differs depending on the demographic, with those living in deprived and urban areas or those aged between 16 and 24 being at a greater risk of being victims of crime. Although in general crime is decreasing, there are significant changes in terms of the types of crimes experienced. In particular, cybercrimes have nearly doubled since 2019-2020. In Scotland, in 2021 and 2022, at least 5% of recorded crimes were cybercrimes. The increase in cybercrimes is also reflected in what types of crimes participants of the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey were most concerned about, with majority of people being concerned about fraud, for example, their credit card or bank details being stolen. The Recorded Crime in Scotland report provides a breakdown of crimes that were recorded to the police. These include 32% crimes of dishonesty, 24% non-sexual violence, 21% crimes against society, 15% damage and reckless behavior, 5% sexual crimes, and 1% coronavirus restrictions. Crimes of dishonesty include housebreaking, theft of motor vehicle, shoplifting and fraud, as well as corruption and embezzlement. Importantly, the recorded crime statistics include only those crimes that were reported to the police. For many different reasons, including fear, mistrust in the justice system, and social stigma, many crimes remain unreported, and therefore the statistics may not present an accurate overview and should always be considered critically. Further, Scottish Crime and Justice Survey, which is conducted anonymously, includes a more in-depth view of experienced victimization. For example, Scottish Crime and Justice reports that in 2018 and 2019, majority of violent incidents were not reported to the police, with the estimate being that only 40% of incidents were brought to the attention of the police. More on the experiences of victimization in Scotland can be found in the SCCJR's relevant resource, Victims of Crime.
What are the causes of crime, and what are the differences between biological and social factors? First of all, there's learning resources on these specific topics called Theories and Causes of Crime Part 1 and Theories and Causes of Crime Part 2. So crime is a huge category. For example, it can include crimes of violence, property crime, crimes of dishonesty, corporate crime, sexual crime, environmental crime, and driving offences, to name a few. Crime is also changing, and there are new ways to commit crime. For example, cybercrime is a relatively new crime. As criminologists, we often talk about crime as being a social construct. By that we mean society decides what is and what is not considered to be a crime. For example, some things in the past used to be considered a crime. For example, it was previously a criminal offence to be gay in the United Kingdom. What can be considered to be a crime also varies between different countries and cultures. In terms of what causes crime, there is no definitive answer. No one theory or explanation can explain all crime. But criminology as a discipline does look to understand this. There's been a lot of change in thinking about what causes crime throughout history. For example, some early criminological thinkers are what we call biological positivists. The belief that some people are born criminal and that criminality can be passed down from generations. For example, Lombroso in 1876 published a book called The Criminal Man, and he even believed that certain features, such as the size and shape of foreheads and chins, was an indicator of criminality. Now, these ideas have been heavily discredited, but there are still some biological explanations for some types of crime. For example, a person's gender. For example, men are more likely to commit crime than women. A person's age. Younger people are more likely to commit crime than older people. And a person's personality. For example, aggression or anger. Sociological factors refer to societal or structural factors that can cause crime or are associated with crime. For example, poverty and inequality and related issues such as unemployment or lack of employment opportunities. Sometimes there can be a relationship between biological factors and social factors.
One of the common narratives in popular culture, in true crime podcasts, on TV, on the news, is that prison is the main form of punishment. The reality is rather different. Many people are sentenced to punishment in the community, and the surrounding context of that in Scotland is called community justice. In some other nations, it's called probation or community corrections. What does it involve? Well, each year thousands of people are giving community sanctions and measures. That means that they're not being sentenced to prison, they're being given another type of sentence. And that can involve a few different requirements or options within it. Some of those are listed here. If we think about the aims and the purposes of sentencing and punishment, community sentences can realise some of these perhaps better than a prison sentence or a custodial sentence. It depends on the nature of the crime and the surrounding circumstances and the characteristics of the person being sentenced. Some of the principles and purposes that are relevant are around, is the sentence proportionate and is it similar across cases? So this is where community sentences that might be imposed because they're more proportionate for a crime, for example, shoplifting or theft or vandalism or breach of the peace, whereas a crime like murder would attract a mandatory sentence of a custodial or prison sentence. So what happens in the community? A court and a sheriff or a judge can require a person to be supervised by a justice social worker, and that's to address the reasons for their offending. So they could make referrals to the types of support services that they need, they could do assessments about risk, and they could have conversations that supervise the person's progress through doing their unpaid work hours, which is also called their community service, or they might be expected to go to treatment to address issues connected with drug use, alcohol use, or mental ill health. They might be asked to participate in rehabilitative programs, and that could be around victim empathy. It could be for particular crime types like relationships and addressing issues connected to domestic abuse or sex offending. There could also be other types of restrictions that are imposed to reduce risk and protect the public, and that includes protecting victims. People might be required to be careful or have parameters around their internet access and communication, or not to approach certain people or go to certain places. Sometimes a sheriff or a judge can impose an electronic monitoring tagging requirement. You might have seen someone wearing a tag in the movie about crime and criminal justice. That can monitor a person staying home during certain hours, or the GPS tags can monitor where they are, and that can make sure that authorities know whether they're going near victims or certain places where they've committed crime before. So punishment in the community can involve a number of things. Each year it involves thousands of fines or financial penalties being imposed. Scottish justice has so much more to it than only a focus on prison. There's a lot that happens in local communities.
What is the role of prisons, and do prisons work? Prisons have existed in one form or another for much of known history. In the 16th and 17th century, punishment was much more visible, with public hangings, floggings, and brandings commonplace. From the late 17th and during the 18th century, transportation was often given as an alternative punishment to execution. This is where large ships full of people convicted of crimes were sent to penal colonies in far-reaching parts of the then British Empire, such as America and Australia. This punishment was often grueling and involved manual labour, with the additional punishment of sending people away from their homes and families, with the majority of them being unable to return. During the 18th and 19th century in the UK, there was a period of prison reform where campaigners such as John Howard, who founded the Howard League for Penal Reform, which is still going strong today, called out prison conditions as well as the awful treatment of the people housed there. Jeremy Bentham was a social reformer, philosopher, and a utilitarian, which meant he believed in the greatest happiness for the largest number of people. He advocated for rational punishments that fit the crime and believed that this would deter people from committing crime in the future. Bentham designed a prison known as a panopticon, which you can see on the slide here. This was also known as the all-seeing prison. Due to its circular design, it allowed for a large number of prisoners to be monitored from the centre by few guards. This created a feeling of being watched 24/7, which in turn encouraged compliance from the prisoners and is a design which does persist today. Following on from this period of penal reform, the focus of prisons was very much on punishment and deterrence, but in recent decades there has been growing support to move towards rehabilitation as a way to increase public safety and reduce reoffending. At this point, it's important to highlight that Scotland's prison population is amongst the highest in Europe and the highest in the UK, with a rate of 137 per 100,000 inhabitants. To put this into perspective, the European average is roughly 116 per 100,000. In terms of what role prisons play, there is some debate over what the purpose of these institutions should be within society. There are 4 common arguments given for sentencing people to prison, which are public protection, by removing individuals from society, punishment as a proportional response to the crime committed, deterrent, the threat of prison as a way of putting people off from committing crime, and rehabilitation, to support people away from offending behaviour. Whilst there's some disagreement around the extent to which the prison system successfully performs these functions, there is strong evidence which shows prison is a harmful environment in a number of ways. First of all, it is important to point out that people who find themselves entangled in the justice system often share characteristics and life histories. For example, they are more likely to have come from disadvantaged backgrounds, have experienced trauma, and suffer from poor mental health. Prisons cause existing mental health concerns to get worse, but can also be the cause of poor mental health in others. Prisons do this in a number of ways, such as isolation from family and friends, loss of independence, and exposure to violence within the prison system. The HMP Inspector of Prisons report 2020 found that 71% of women in prison reported having mental health issues compared to 47% of men. As with most mental health statistics, this is likely an underestimation. People from minority ethnic backgrounds are also subject to institutional racism, which disadvantages them in all areas of the justice system. Other characteristics such as gender, age, and social class also have an impact on people's experiences. Lack of family contact has a detrimental impact, as they may have been sent to a prison far away from their homes and their families, and it can be difficult and expensive for relatives to visit. This will have an especially negative impact on parent-children relationships, not to mention the long-lasting impact on the children of having their parent imprisoned. Imprisonment can also lead to loss of jobs, with only 25% of men and 20% of women leaving prison with employment. However, we also have to acknowledge that the complex needs of justice-involved people can mean that they are not physically or mentally well enough to participate in employment upon release. Imprisonment also impacts on housing, as depending on the length of sentence, people could lose their tenancies and end up homeless. These negative impacts then cause, in turn, increased pressure and demand on social care services within the community, which are already struggling due to increased workload and budget cuts. We must also remember that there are a number of people in prison on remand, which means they have not yet been convicted of a crime, but the court has decided that they should remain in prison until their trial. This could be for a number of reasons, such as the seriousness of their alleged offence or for public protection. The use of remand has also increased in recent years, whilst the average daily population of sentenced people has decreased within the same time period. Therefore, there's a significant number of people in prison who are technically not yet found guilty, but are still subject to the same negative effects of imprisonment. Trying to assess whether prison works is a difficult task, as people in prison may have committed more serious crimes or have different life histories compared to, for example, those subject to community disposals. However, if we look at the statistics in relation to reconviction rates in 2018-2019, for community payback orders, the reconviction rate was 29.2%, and for individuals released from custody, the reconviction rate was 43.8%. This suggests that prison may not be as effective as community sentences, but as previously stated, it's not a straightforward comparison to make. Figures suggest that the average cost of a community payback order is just under £2,000, compared to that of roughly £37,000 it costs to keep someone in prison for 1 year. However, these figures are from a couple of years ago, so it is safe to assume that the cost of each has risen. However, it is clear that community sentences are much cheaper than prison, whilst keeping individuals at home in their own community and mitigating against the harms caused by prison. You can also access the learning resources on prison, which is available from the SCCJR website and goes into more detail on this topic.
What does prison life look like, and what can be improved to prevent offending inside prisons? Again, we have a learning resource on prison life in Scotland on the SCCJR website. There are 17 prisons in Scotland. 15 are managed by the Scottish Prison Service and 2 are managed by private companies under contract to the Scottish Prison Service. Each prison in Scotland is a little bit different. For example, they vary in size and location between rural and urban areas, and the types of prisoners they accommodate, for example, men, women, young offenders, and lengths of custodial sentence. The design of most prisons in Scotland are maximum security with perimeters and gates, although some have less security. For example, they're open prisons or have open conditions attached. Each prisoner is individually assessed for risk. All these different situations and characteristics mean that what prison life is like varies. However, the aim is for prisoners to be involved in what is called purposeful activity where possible. This is essential for rehabilitation and includes lots of different things, including education, having a job, and keeping in touch with their friends and family. For work or training, prisoners can have jobs in prison. For example, they're reimbursed a small wage. They can work as cleaners, kitchen and laundry assistants. They can also make things like garden furniture and repair bikes. In terms of education, prisoners can gain qualifications, for example, SQA qualifications like you're doing at the moment, as well as college and university level courses. The Open University currently offers a degree programme for some prisons in Scotland. Other forms of purposeful activity include keeping in touch with friends and family through prison visiting, for example, exercising and engaging in rehabilitative programmes, including stopping smoking, support for alcohol and drug problems, and counselling. The second part of the question is what can be done to prevent offending inside prisons? All prisoners have a right to be kept safe in prison. There's an obligation on the state to keep prisons as safe as possible for all those who are there. That includes prisoners themselves, staff working there, as well as visitors. Sometimes acts of violence occur. The evidence shows that this is most likely to occur if there's a lack or poor quality purposeful activity, which I just mentioned. Violence can also occur if there's not enough staff, if the environment is poor, and if the relationship between staff and prisoners is negative. Sometimes violent or threatening acts take place due to an existing relationship between prisoners, for example, if they were in rival gangs before going into prison. This question comes back to the importance of rehabilitation and supporting people in prison to have meaningful opportunities, and that helps reduce the likelihood of offending both during prison stays and after release. What are the rates of offending amongst children and young people? Again, we have a learning resource on the SCCJR webpage on youth justice with more information. So in Scotland, a child is defined differently in different legal contexts, but in most cases, children are considered to be under the age of 18, and young people are considered to be those aged between 19 and 26. What are the rates of offending amongst children and young people? It's important to highlight some things. There are different ways of capturing the extent and nature of crime in general, as has been discussed already. And when it comes to youth crime, we use a lot of the same sources: official statistics, recorded crime, and surveys. These are important sources of information, but they're not perfect, and there are some key gaps. What is known about this topic, though, is that children and young people in general are not involved in crime. Most children and young people are not involved in crime. If they do become involved in crime, it is for minor offences in most occasions. Serious offending is rare. Another important point is that if children and young people do become involved in crime, they tend to go out of it as they get older. This is known as the age crime curve in criminology. Youth crime in Scotland, and indeed elsewhere, is falling steadily and has been in recent years. How is youth offending dealt with? The youth justice system in Scotland is underpinned by what is called a welfareist approach. This means that the welfare of children who commit crime is the paramount consideration, and this is tied to the belief that children who commit crime are in need of care and supports in the same way that those whose needs are not being met, for example, those who are not being well looked after, also need care and support. And often these are the same children. For example, children who are not well looked after are more likely to be involved in offending in the first place. This approach means that these needs are considered first before any consideration is given to possible punishment. This approach means that the aim is for children to not enter the criminal justice system in the first place. This fits with GIRFIC, getting it right for every child, the whole system approach, and UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. If a child is under 16 and is involved in crime, they will be referred to the children's reporter, who will then refer to the children's hearing system, also known as children's panels. Young people aged 16 and 17 are more likely to be dealt with by a court. Taking what we've said already and what we know about prison causing harm and having a lasting impact, the current policy is that if a young person does appear in court, all options should be explored to avoid secure care or prison, especially prison. Secure care is where a young person will stay in accommodation run by a local authority.
So, what did Karl Marx say about crime? Firstly, it is important to emphasize that crime and deviance were not a central focus for Marx in his original writings. One of his key arguments was that the capitalist system brutalizes the poor, encouraging immorality and creating conditions which might force people to commit crimes. Further, Marxist criminologists suggest that laws were designed to protect the interests of the powerful social elites rather than work in the interest of the wider society. This means that the powerful are in charge of the criminal justice system, having the ability to make and bend the law in their own favor. It was also argued that capitalism only thrives on the working classes being exploited for the benefit of the rich, and the systemic inequalities push people into poverty, meaning that many aren't able to satisfy their basic needs, with crime being one of the available options. Consequently, the poor tend to be criminalized by the criminal justice system, while the rich are able to get away with their crimes. According to Marxist criminologists, class structure means that criminal behavior is inevitable, and crime is the product of the economic and political system, with the working classes being set up for failure from the very beginning, due to the little opportunities they have to break out of the class division. Marx's theory of crime can be linked to Robert Merton's strain theory, which suggests that people strive to achieve the end goal of the American dream. However, the legal means to achieve this goal are not attainable for everyone, and those unable to reach the goal through legal means might resort to crime. This is the result of the capitalist system encouraging consumption and generation of wealth. As with every criminological theory, there are some criticism. One way Marx's understanding of crime can be criticized is in relation to the rational crime theory. Marxists presume that crime is the result of structural inequalities and gaps between social classes, rather than individuals' rational choice. In this way, some crimes, which are not committed out of the desire for economic gain, may be overlooked. It is important, however, to be aware that explanations for crime will differ depending on the theoretical standpoint. Some of the key theories are mentioned in this presentation and can also be accessed through the SCCJR's learning resources. One last important thing to mention is that it is crucial to distinguish between what is Marx's theory of crime and what was actually said by Karl Marx. Marxist criminologists have built their theory of crime based on original works of Marx, providing interpretations of crime that did not necessarily appear in those original texts.
What is the role of the police in managing large-scale public events such as football games? Considering how policing is conducted at large-scale public events illuminates different ways we can think about the different purposes of the police. The first of these is the idea that the purpose of the police is to enforce the law, which means to detect, prevent, and deter crime through police practices. And the second of these is that the purpose of the police is to maintain order and keep the peace, which means building relationships with communities to improve trust and confidence in the police and promote community safety and well-being. Looking at the first purpose, the police are often present at large-scale public events to enforce the law. They do so through practices such as conducting stop and searches, which is where the police are empowered to search a person that they reasonably believe is in possession of an item prohibited under the law, such as a knife or drugs, or seizing alcohol if a person is carrying alcohol in a place where it is not permitted, and, where necessary, arresting people who have committed an offence, such as singing sectarian songs. Although the police will not be present at all football matches, football supporters are heavily policed in the UK. And sometimes this type of policing involves invasive practices, forceful and heavy-handed policing styles, and even covert surveillance, which refers to the gathering of intelligence on supporters who are believed to be involved in disorder, violence, or crime related to football matches. And this type of heavy-handed law enforcement policing has historically contributed to a breakdown in trust between the police and football supporters. But the police are not only present at large-scale events to enforce the law, they are also there to maintain order and promote safety and well-being in the communities they serve. So looking to the second purpose of policing, the police are also often present at large-scale events to maintain order and keep the peace. In Scotland, the police are duty-bound to improve safety and well-being by working in and with local communities. And at large-scale football matches, you will see this type of policing. You may, for instance, see police officers who watch over the crowds, engage with supporters, have a chat, have a laugh, and offer support and assistance where needed. The police are generally present in this function to protect public welfare, such as quelling signs of disorder to prevent it ballooning into larger scale violence, and the police often work in partnership with other emergency services, such as the NHS and other agencies, such as events management and even football clubs themselves. So to summarise, in thinking about how policing is undertaken at large-scale events, like football matches, this helps us to think about the different roles and purposes of the police in the UK.
What is the role of technology in detecting and responding to crime? The question of the impact of technology on crime and policing has become more common in the last few years, in particular due to the noticeable increase in cybercrime, making it one of the crimes people are worried about the most. This is predominantly due to the changing landscape of crime, with technologies constantly evolving, making it easier for criminals to commit offenses, and simultaneously making it more difficult for police to monitor and respond to those. Some of the crimes that have emerged since the development of the internet and new technologies include different forms of online harassment. Further, other crimes have been easier to facilitate due to new technologies, including child and human trafficking, drug trafficking, or stalking, meaning that those technologies are now used in many ways to not only commit new crimes, but also giving criminals easier access to victims. Further, the development of the internet also offers criminals more opportunities to avoid detection, for example, through maintaining their anonymity. This changing landscape of crime has forced policing tactics to evolve in order to adapt to those changes, for example, in terms of the physical technologies that are used to investigate crimes. The popularization of social media has also had impact on crime, with issues such as police surveillance on the internet and data protection being brought up more frequently in discussions surrounding the ways in which the police are responding to crimes online. For example, the police is increasingly engaging with social media and other online platforms to detect online grooming and instances of child abuse online. Importantly, globalization has had a significant impact on crime and policing, with many cybercrimes being committed by individuals based in different places around the world. The transnational character of those crimes means that local police forces find it necessary to collaborate with each other in order to engage in more effective policing. The transnational cooperation is enabled by international agencies such as Interpol and Europol. Importantly, while many consider Interpol to be international police, their role is focused on facilitating worldwide police cooperation and crime control. Consequently, it is not a law enforcement agency, but rather provides investigative support, expertise, and training to law enforcement around the world. focusing in particular on terrorism, cybercrime, and organized crime. Similarly, Europol's main objective is to improve the effectiveness and cooperation between the law enforcement agencies of the EU through the exchange of information and intelligence, analytical support, and specialized training. Europol, same as Interpol, does not have any executive powers, and its officials are not able to arrest suspects, conduct independent investigations, or act without prior approval from authorities from the member states.
Here are a list of references or sources that we think will be of use to you. Please have a look at these. And here are some more. Thank you very much for listening to our webinar today. Here is more information about our project team. And as we've mentioned in this webinar, please do have a look at the learning resources which you can find on the SCCJR webpage. Thank you very much.